So when Trump entered the White House for the first time in 2017, Forbes magazine estimated his wealth to be around $3.1 billion. They now have him pegged for $5.1 billion. We're going to get into the history of Trump's finances, but just to begin, I wanted to ask, to what extent can we trust these figures? And how significant has the idea of Trump's wealth been to building his political brand?
Well, trusting the figures that estimate Donald Trump's wealth has always been not a great idea. Forbes has done yeoman's work. They do their best. But when they first started, they ultimately had to admit after 5 years that he had been lying to them for years. And he was broke at that point in time in the late 1980s. And they had not caught on to that. They were still estimating him to be a billionaire, I think, at that point. So that's always sort of difficult work. I think right now it's even more difficult because his core assets have been languishing. There's some challenges in some of the buildings that he owns. And the big bump in wealth that Forbes is talking about now is due to these ventures into cryptocurrencies that are very new, very hard to value, and fluctuate second by second. And it's not even clear when he could cash those out. A lot of it's based on Truth Social. If he cashed out that investment, which today I think is worth about $2.5 billion, it would no doubt completely crush that company if he sold his share. So it's a matter in flux, and it's always changing. As to the politics, I don't think there was anything more important to Donald Trump's election originally, both times really, than the perception that he was a very successful businessman and had created a multi-billion-dollar fortune entirely on his own. That's the story he told. It was never true. And it's the story that The Apprentice, a television series for more than a decade here, really reinforced every week to the viewing audience. And we heard that on the campaign trail then, and again in this recent campaign, that people believe he's successful because they saw him being successful on television.
Let's go back to the start of that story that you reference. And in Donald Trump's telling of events, his father gave him a small loan of $1 million, setting aside the enormous privilege that already represents. I mean, how much of that is true? And what is he leaving out of this sort of personal, relatively hard scrabble, as he likes to present it, story of going from relatively humble beginnings, albeit with all of those caveats, to where he is now?
That story is entirely untrue. We worked for years to get Fred Trump's financial records. That's Donald Trump's father. Fred Trump was an enormously successful real estate developer from the 1930s through the 1970s, when he basically handed the company over to his son. Just on what we could track from those financial records, Donald Trump, in today's money, inherited almost $500 million from his father. His father bankrolled all his early efforts. He introduced him to the mayor of New York City, who just gave him carte blanche to approve his early projects because he was Fred Trump's son. His father covered his losses when various things failed, and really propped him up through some very bad years. There's no doubt that Donald Trump would not be the Donald Trump we see before us if he hadn't have gotten that money and that support from his father.
How does Donald Trump differ from his father and his father's approach to business?
That was, I think, one of the most interesting experiences for us in researching this book, was that Fred Trump was very deliberate, very careful. He would map out before he even invested anything in a project, how much it was going to cost, what he would get in rents on the other side, what his financing would be, how much time he had to cover those things before he started collecting money. And we only found one episode in about a 50-year building career where he ever didn't succeed. Donald Trump was never careful like that. He spent a lot on buildings. He spent a lot on construction. He tended to make things the way he wanted them to be, trophy properties, he would call them. And he believed that because his name was on the outside and he was trying to make it the best, that the dollars at the end would match the expenses. And a lot of his career was repeating the same lesson that just doesn't work out. And that was very, very different from his father.
Can you talk us through some of the trophy properties theory of money making and some examples of where that fell down?
Sure. I mean, one was the Plaza Hotel in New York City, a very famous old hotel that by the 1980s was going broke and was not in great shape. And Donald Trump paid more than $400 million for it, which he acknowledged at the time was not a great investment. It was too much money, but he was going to spend more to get it fixed up and make it work. He did spend more on it, and he ultimately lost the hotel to his bank. That was one key example. Another one was his venture into an airline shuttle. He bought an airline shuttle that was losing money, spent more money fixing up the aircraft themselves, putting gold and leather everywhere. His own employees said, "Boss, don't do this. We don't really know how to run an airline, and we don't know how to deal with the unions or air traffic control or anything." He did it anyway, made it into what he thought was the premier, most beautiful shuttle ever, and never made money on it, lost money, and ultimately had to give it over to his banks. And that repeated itself right up through his most recent development project, which was remodeling an old post office in Washington, D.C. into a hotel. It was a major project. He spent more than $200 million. All the other competitors, big hotel companies, said the money that he's bidding, that he's promising to spend on this, is going to make it impossible for him to ever make money. He said, "Oh, no, I'll make it. It'll be so beautiful. We'll always make money." It was beautiful in the particular way Donald Trump designs buildings, but he never had a profitable year on that project during the 7 years he owned it, and ultimately had to sell it.
He also had ventures in the sports world. Can you talk us through the saga of the New Jersey Generals for listeners who might not be familiar?
I think that's an interesting one. I think if you look back at that, you see Donald Trump around 30 years old behaving much like you see him now, making the same sort of moves that would strike a lot of people as mistakes. There was an upstart football league trying to compete with the NFL, which has been the dominant sports affiliation in the United States for a long time. And the idea was, we're going to create this spring football, because football has a short season, at the time just 15 or 16 weeks. We're going to create this spring thing that'll fill in that interest there is in football and the other times of the year. So they started out these teams. It was sort of a ragtag operation. Some rich people bought teams, and they were muddling along. And then Donald Trump bought a team, but he said, "We're going to go head to head with the NFL. We're going to start airing our games in the fall, and I'm going to deliver the networks to you. All the networks will give us a big contract. It's going to work out great. And I'm not going to stay in the spring because that's what losers do, and I'm not a loser." He ultimately convinced the other owners, against many of their better judgment, to do that. They tried it. Lo and behold, they couldn't get a television contract. Donald Trump couldn't deliver the networks as he said. He sued, saying that the NFL was a monopoly and was colluding to keep out competition, which a lot of people would just say is competition. And he said, "We're going to sue them, we're going to break that, and then we're going to be in the fall and we're going to wipe out the NFL." They lost the lawsuit. I mean, they actually prevailed in the lawsuit, but the awards on it were just $1, because they said, yes, the NFL had been very competitive in trying to keep out competition, but there was nothing untoward in what they did. So we'll just give you $1 in damages. And it wiped out that upstart league. They never played another game again once Donald Trump's decision-making took control.
Where does he get the money, or how has he gotten the money to keep doing this? You talk about the initial large loan from his father, but you also write in Lucky Loser about these tremendous sums he's been able to borrow from various banks with only his word as the guarantee. How has he managed to pull that off?
There's no one good answer to that. I mean, you have to remember, I think, as a starting point, that from his father, he got about $500 million in today's money. From being on The Apprentice, the show itself, and then all the sort of fame and celebrity deals that came with that, without any business expertise. He got another $500 million in today's money from that. And then he got pushed into an investment against his will that's also generated another $500 million. That's $1.5 billion for nothing that required any business expertise at all, just being himself. If you think about that, if he would have invested that in the stock market as he got it, he would be worth like $6, $7, $8, $9, $10 billion today, having just stayed at home and watched television. Instead, he built these businesses, as you said, and he's always tried to put up the facade that those businesses were the result of his great success, but they've been underwritten all along by that sort of easy money, if you will. And also by, I think, what you're getting at, that he's borrowed a lot of money, probably more than $1 billion, certainly more than $1 billion. And some of that, a lot of that he's not paid back. A lot of that he's been able to get out of, even having to pay a portion of. And then we also uncovered through the years some dicey tax claims that he made that greatly lowered his tax exposure. And he has, throughout his life, had a habit of not meeting his promises when he's in business with people. So he'll hire lawyers and tell them he's going to pay them a certain amount. And then if the case doesn't go his way, which sometimes is a predictable outcome, he just won't pay them. We found numerous instances with contractors where he's putting up a building for hundreds of millions of dollars. And then at the end, he just calls everybody in and says, I'm only going to pay you 50 cents on the dollar, and you can sue me for it, but you're going to lose more than you would if you just took my 50 cents on the dollar. So that's a lot of different ways that he's been able to evade the outcome of his own, the sort of repercussions of his own decision making. But I think the original enabling factor is all the money he got for not having to be good at business.
You detail in your book multiple bankruptcies of his businesses, but yet he has managed to avoid personal bankruptcy. Is that luck? Is it skill? How has he managed to avoid that sort of consequence?
Well, it's certainly the skill of his bankruptcy lawyers in those cases. They did very well to help him avoid that. The original bankruptcy came in the late 80s, early 1990s. And there was a wave because he had built this sort of paper empire on borrowed money, where banks didn't even know all the other banks were loaning him money. He had issued junk bonds to build some of the most expensive casinos that were ever built in Atlantic City. And then it all came crashing down at one time. And at that point in time, for the banks almost pushed him into personal bankruptcy, but then they would have had to own money-losing casinos, a money-losing hotel, a money-losing airline. And they didn't want those things. So they thought that they could take some of those away, sell some of them, find buyers for them. They let him find buyers for some and do better than they would if they just took the whole thing and pushed him into sort of receivership. The later bankruptcies were again for the casinos. It was a 20-year record of failure there, where he kept piling on more debt, more expensive debt, and the casinos continually fell into disrepair. But they were, again, worth more. There was a few times where you saw judges having to decide whether to take Donald Trump out of the picture and let the stockholders, once the company went public, sort of find some other way to go. And there was a determination that the promotional ability he brought to it, just bringing attention to the casinos, was worth something. And so they kept him in the mix. And other times it's just, he's really kind of on the cusp of it, it looks like, but he'll get out of some debt, get out of some taxes, and be able to live for another day.
You mentioned his time on The Apprentice. How important was that for his political career and for cementing this perception of him as this very wealthy, powerful, successful businessman, despite this long trail of failures that you detail him leaving behind him?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's one of the great mysteries of modern American history. I mean, he had been famous in New York for not doing very well in businesses, but he was this great sideshow. He dished to the tabloids about his ex-wives and his girlfriends and about the girlfriends and ex-wives of other people he knew. He was very much kind of traded in that world, and that made him famous but not widely respected. And it actually, when The Apprentice showed up in 2004, he was not doing terribly well. He was trying to cobble together some golf courses that he was buying out of bankruptcy. He had just pushed his siblings to sell all of their father's real estate interests, which was against their father's will, to get himself a couple $100 million. And then Mark Burnett, this revolutionary television producer from the UK, came over and decided to create this show. He had been a great success with Survivor, and he wanted to do something where he could be in the United States, closer to his kids. And so he had the idea of doing Survivor in the city. And that's how he found Donald Trump. And in doing that, he completely remade Donald Trump. They had to create a fake boardroom and Trump Tower that looked like a sort of uber powerful person because the real offices were not in great shape. And they created this 2-minute introduction to the show that I still think is one of the greatest political ads ever created, where it made Donald Trump look like the king of New York City, of the whole Northeast. Everything he did was successful and covered in gold. And he had this story that he had had some hard times, but he had fought his way back bigly. And that repeated week after week, and with just little snippets of Donald Trump in a boardroom looking decisive and important, had a big impact. We also talked to producers who said they edited out all the parts where he seemed incoherent and didn't make sense. They would just reinvent a show to make his decision look logical. But that was a very powerful thing, repeated week after week after week, sometimes in episodes that went on for 2 hours, that reinforced that image of him for millions of Americans.
What lessons do you think he has learned from that experience of sort of displaying wealth and power, and his repeated experiences of going to the verge of bankruptcy and back? Do you think he has taken away key lessons from those experiences?
It's very difficult to look at someone and judge them conclusively, but it's also really hard to find growth in Donald Trump's life. He seems to make the same sort of judgment calls over and over again. All of those business problems that caused him difficulties throughout his life, he makes the same kind of problems over and over again, which is not listening to people around him who say that's not the right way to go. He just fires them, which is not listening to people who have subject matter expertise in the area. He just ignores them and sometimes sues them to cause them more problems. And then when the predictable outcome arrives, he blames somebody else, oftentimes throughout his life, saying people are out to get me just because I'm Donald Trump. He started saying that before he was 30 years old. So those kind of things just repeat. And I think he actually believes now that people have been out to get him, that he's had a difficult life and the world has not been a fair place to him. It's hard to reconcile with a guy who's gotten $1 billion for being born and being on television, but that's a big part of who he is.
He's now back in the White House, and he is now demonstrably very interested in Bitcoin and the crypto industry. How long of a tail is there to that? Is this a long-running interest he's had, or do you see this as something he's picked up more recently?
This is brand spanking new. He had been a crypto detractor through at least 2021, the last time he really said anything about it, when he said that it was, sort of funny money and it was all a big scam. But sometime in the spring last year, some crypto enthusiasts got to him and said, we have people who support this who will give to your campaign. We have people who support this who will support you if you ease up on regulations, and they will vote for you in large numbers. And they arranged for him to speak at a Bitcoin conference hosted by something called Bitcoin Magazine last July, where he said he wanted to fire the chairman of the SEC his first day in office. That drew, much to his surprise, a huge round of applause. He didn't even know people knew who that person was. And so he said it again, and he got even greater applause. And as soon as they got into basing policy on that and raising campaign money from that, again, this is just last summer, they started trying to create businesses that they could personally profit from. They started rolling those out in September. But again, neither his sons, Eric and Don Jr., who have been involved in his business, nor Mr. Trump himself had ever made any public comments in support of cryptocurrencies that I could find before about last spring.
Also, at the Bitcoin conference in Las Vegas last week was the leader of the UK Reform Party, Nigel Farage, who announced that Reform will now be accepting crypto donations as we see the first sort of flares of interest in crypto in the political world in the UK now. What is it, do you think, that makes crypto and Bitcoin so appealing for populists? What's the political side of the argument?
I think that's still developing and we're still learning about that. One common thread that the Trumps have struck here is that they see themselves as persecuted by the traditional financial system in this country. And that puts them very much in line with crypto enthusiasts who believe that there's been too much regulation, who believe they're all seen as criminals. And just because this has been popular with drug dealers and money launderers doesn't mean that they're all drug dealers and money launderers. A line you'll often hear is, a lot of drug dealers deal with cash, but nobody said, let's throw everybody uses cash in prison. But then a key feature of this is the anonymity of it, that when you trade something in crypto, you identify yourself only by a randomized number called, I think, a wallet number. And you can move tens of millions of dollars, limitless amount of money across borders throughout the world without having your name on it. That has a lot of attraction in politics. I don't know how we're going to track whether the Trump organization or the Trump campaign is obtaining their money from any other country. It'd be illegal to take campaign contributions from another country, but it's going to be very difficult to police that. It's a brand new world in politics. But maybe perhaps from a straightforward side, if there's a way people want to spend their money, you want to make that as easily as possible, as you possibly can, much like they started taking credit card donations some years ago.
Is there a sort of anti-government, anti-deep state side of this that Trump is appealing to?
Absolutely. That's a great question. I mentioned that they talk about being persecuted. A big part of that is that Eric Trump and Don Jr. have said they had their bank accounts closed by banks, which they've said was only because of their father's political views. They believe, or at least they say, that the entire U.S. regulatory system is out to get them because of their father's efforts in politics. That again puts them in line with a lot of crypto people who feel the same way. There's not a lot to support that. In this case, the way that they've described they're having their accounts shut down sounds very much like the way millions of Americans have their accounts shut down because of some changes in the last 5 years about how banks have to deal with large transactions they see but can't necessarily account for. But that's an animating concept of both the Trump campaign and of this move into digital currencies.
We've seen already this year Trump and First Lady Melania Trump set up their own meme coins. How much of a potential vulnerability is that in terms of just shielding what could be massive transfers of money, a potential way to transfer? You could see that as a way of incentivizing decisions from the president in a way that is untraceable. How concerning is it that the president has done this?
There's never been, I don't think, anything invented that has a greater potential for the kind of abuse you're describing than these cryptocurrencies and these meme coins, especially. You have to remember these are things that have no value other than as a collectible. It's sort of like a limited edition baseball cap. It only is worth what some other people are willing to pay for it at any point in time. So there's no way to tell whether somebody's paying market rate for it or a lot just because they want to curry favor with the president. There's no way to tell how much anybody who's bought is actually paid because they could have bought it under four different limitless number of wallet numbers. And there's no way to know whether they let the president know through back channels that it was them who made this purchase. You just think about the potential for abuse for that. And it's limitless, I think. And compare it to a cash transaction, where if you send somebody more than $10,000 in cash, banks have to file an activity report with regulators in the United States, where campaign contributions are limited by how an amount you can give generally, although there's some ways around that. Credit cards create a paper trail. There's no paper trail here. There's no limits. There's no holds on anything. We would just have to trust the Trumps to tell us if they were receiving money from someone who was trying to buy their influence.
There's also some reporting from Bloomberg that I think all but 6 of the top holders of the Trump coin are foreign nationals. Is there a potential concern there for foreign policy, or at least the perception of influence on foreign policy?
Sure. I mean, I don't know. Look, the reason most politicians avoid this sort of thing is so that when they make a decision about some other part of the world, say our tariffs on those countries, or how we're going to deal with them if there's a dispute, a territorial dispute with someone, so their decisions and the positions they take will not be called into question because of something like this. That you can look at them and say you may not agree with the policy, but they're not doing it because a CEO of a company there gave them $10 million. I don't know how, for the rest of the Trump administration, any American would rightfully have any faith in those kinds of decisions he's going to be making. Everything is going to be called into question, and some of it we'll know because of reporting and research and perhaps investigations at some point, if he's had financial relationships with the country in question. But some of it we may not know, and so it's going to be this sort of undercurrent for the next 3.5 years.
Can I ask how difficult it was to do your own reporting and the research from this book? Was there intimidation? Was there obstruction? How difficult was it to put real figures and sums on Trump's financial history?
Yeah, I mean, it was challenging because it's challenging to figure those kinds of things out, and especially for a private enterprise where there's very little public record with real numbers on it. And getting someone's tax returns here is a very difficult thing. But the benefit of time to begin with, we did this work for more than 5 years for the New York Times. They gave my co-authors Susanne Craig and I and some other colleagues we worked with a lot of time to work with these things and to figure it out. And we were able to sort of piece it together over those numbers of years by obtaining family financial records and tax records, and then gathering the usual outside records of lawsuits and developing sources that had been close to the Trumps. So it's a long process, but it's the thing we enjoy about doing this kind of work.
Last question, just looking ahead here. One of the things I was really struck by ahead of the election, speaking to people at Trump rallies, was how much stock they seemed to set in this idea of Trump, the businessman, that he was wealthy, that he was so rich, was not something they held against him. It was something so many people seemed to actively admire, and they put a lot of faith into this idea that once he was back in the White House, we're going to get the Trump economy back, prices are going to come down, the cost of living is going to come down. But so far, not only is there no sign of that happening, but we can see him and his family getting richer and richer in real time. Where do you see this heading? Do you think there could be a real political vulnerability for the president and for his movement if he is seen to be getting wealthier and wealthier while not delivering on his promises on the economy?
Yeah, I mean,
is that wishful thinking?
I think your question is a great summation of sort of where we are with all of this right now as a country and maybe through the whole world. One of the magic aspects of Donald Trump's life is the degree to which he was able to create an impression from the time he was a young man that was very different from the reality and benefit from that. And part of that was the era he came up in. Before the 1980s, ostentatious shows of wealth were sort of frowned upon. Wealthy people tried to stay out of the press generally and maybe didn't have big toys that drew attention to their wealth. He was very much in the mix when that all started to change and benefited from that change more than anyone else. And it is a mystery here how you get from people who maybe historically would have looked aside, had a little bit of a side eye at people who were really rich and really showy when they're really struggling in their lives, and why they would believe that person's suddenly going to take their interests to heart. That's part of Donald Trump's magic act, I think, is to be able to convince people of things. And maybe it's obvious on his face he's not being truthful about it and it doesn't match the patterns of his life, but he can sell that to wide numbers of people. Normally, you would think that would eventually come back to haunt a politician. I think back to George W. Bush being asked how much I think a carton of milk cost, and he didn't know. And this was a scandalous thing. It showed how detached he was from the ebb and flow of most Americans' lives. Donald Trump faces no reckoning like that. I think part of that is because our media landscape has changed. There's a place where he can go where everybody always knows his name, and they're always glad you came. And all day long, they give you reinforcing ideas on how Trump is doing things that are good for all Americans. And more importantly, I think for that dynamic, how other people are trying to do things that will hurt your life. And that seems to be the real basis of it, to convince us large number of Americans that if he's not there, it'll be much, much worse than it is now. And how that's going to change and when it would change, I don't think is knowable. But I do think just on the margins, if you look at this last election, if you think about the number of Americans who voted for him for the reasons you're talking about, because they thought the economy was not going well for them, and maybe they didn't have a tight bond to him. If things don't improve by our midterm elections, when control of certainly the House of Representatives will be decided again next November, you could see this start to change. And if they lose the House, everything would get much, much more difficult for the Trump administration.